because it's a tough daf, though not too long. So today's daf, finally in Parak Otovet Beno, which really is the beginning of the end of the Masechta. That's the truth. It's a long end, to be clear, but it's 8 or 9 prakim, some number, a large number, eight, I think, which basically all follow the same model, right? Otovet Beno, Noheg Ba'aretz, B'chutz La'aretz, etc. It's B'fnei Abayit, Lo B'fnei Abayit, which we'll see for all of the other prakim, pretty much, which is why we follow that model. And yesterday we mentioned, so we're starting from 3 lines from the top of Ayin Tet Amud Aleph, Amar Rav Huna. Forgot that. So the machloket we had yesterday was a very interesting machloket of Hananya and the Chachamim, the Tanakama, as to whether Otovet Beno applies just to the mother who births the baby and the child, or also the father. The words we use are Choshishim L'Zer Ha'av, or Ein Choshishim L'Zer Ha'av, which the word Choshesh is, doesn't mean worry like we usually have it, but it means, is there halachic concern for the zera, for the seed of the father? So it says in Gemara today we have a very similar halacha. Well, before we get there, sorry. Amar Rav Huna bar Chiya Amar Shmuel, Hilchata ki Chananya. The halacha is like Chananya, that you are Choshesh L'Zer Ha'av, right? And therefore, you'd be over Otovet Beno for the father and the child. And Azda Shmuel Tameh. Now, this is Shmuel L'Shitato, who said this similar halacha in a very different context, which was the following. It's not. This is a Mishnah in Kilayim. Okay? Mishnah says, 5 lines from the top. Happy birthday, Nava. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, Hanodim min hasus. If you have a child, right, a baby animal, because you don't know exactly what these are, that is born from a mother that's a horse, Ava pisha avihem chamar, even though the father is a donkey, which we call what's it called again? Horse and donkey,
Mule.
a mule.
No.
Has a name, right? Shoot. Anyways, we'll get there. It's so hard to have these things. A donkey and a horse, right? Shoot, that's a name. Anyways, we'll get there. So you have a baby,
Mule.
a mule. Okay, it's
A female horse, a male donkey is a mule, and a pinny if it's a male horse and a female donkey.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. So those are the names. I never heard of this.
What was the second one?
Hinny, Hinny.
Oh, okay.
News to me. So if you there's a lot of stuff here that's news to us. Anyways, the baby animal was born from a horse, and the father was a chamor, and you have a second one. This is the assumption right now. So you have multiple animals in this flock that are born from horses or a horse, and their father is a chamor. Says the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says, mutarim zeh b'zeh, that these animals can be breeded with each other. It's not considered kilayim, because even though they are mixed, they're all the same mixture. That's what it sounds like. Aval hanodim min hachamor im hanodim min hasus asurim. If you have one animal whose parents are chamor and sus, but the male is the chamor and the female is the sus, and the opposite for the other one, so whatever the names you just said,
Hinny.
a hinny, then they're asurim, they're asur to mate with each other, because even though they're both 50% horse and 50% donkey, they're not the same 50%, right? So you can't say, oh, these are mixed and they're the same thing. And says Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, this is the Shmuel we're quoting, Zu divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda, Da Amar ein choshishim l'zer ha'av. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda, who says you don't pay attention to the father's progeny, or zera, or seed. So basically, if the mother of one is a horse, it's a horse. If the mother of one is a donkey, it's a donkey, and they can't mate with each other. Aval chachamim omrim, but the rabbis, the chachamim would say, kol mine pradot achaten. All pradot, which here we're using one word for what in English is 2 words, right? All mixtures of donkey and horse are the same status. Doesn't matter if it's the mother, the father, it's 50-50 basically. And so you see from here that Shmuel is paskening, or saying the Chachamim argue, and man Chachamim, Chananyahu. That's the Chachamim is Chananya Damar Choshishim L'Zer Ha'av, right? It's Chananya who says that you pay attention to the influence, let's say, of the father. The Hai Bar Susya V'Chamra. One animal is the child of a horse and a chamor. Again, it might be a male horse and a female chamor, and the other is bar chamra v'susya, But even though they're different mothers, kulu chadamina ninu, it's all one species. And so that's the machloket Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim about Choshishim Zera Avernad, which is the same machloket as Hananya and the Chachamim that we had yesterday. And the fact
it's great. Why can we use them? They're Kalayim. Like the first issue is Kalayim.
right, so you shouldn't have necessarily done that. We're not saying, but once you've done that,
You can
or
use
it
it.
happened, right? The question is, what is the animal? Correct.
Mhm.
So the first one was Kilayim, mixing the horse and the donkey. So that wasn't, I'm not saying you're allowed to do that, but if it was done, or you
It happened.
buy them or whatever, yeah, it happened. So says the Gemara now today. We're actually going to switch gears from Hananya and the Chachamim to Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, which is, as we just said, is essentially the same machloket, but we'll see that's a little bit more complicated because why not? Ibaylu. Ask the Gemara around 10, 12 lines from the top, if you have this one. Is it Mifshat Pashat Le Rabbi Yehuda Dein Choshishim L'Zera Av? Is it when Rabbi Yehuda said you don't worry about the father, right? And the consequence, of not worrying about the father is that in this case, the fact that one animal has a mother that's a horse and a father that's a donkey, and the other has a mother that's a donkey and the father that's a horse, they can't be together, right? They can't be breeded together. Is that because he knows the father as if it doesn't exist? So one's a donkey and one's a horse. Odilma spooky misafkale. Or maybe he wasn't sure. He said, I don't know if you pay attention to the father or not. And therefore, since there's a possibility that you can't have these animals breed with each other. But maybe he's unsure. Now, says where, what does it matter? Either way, they can't be together, right? The mainaf kamina. Well, the question is, what about mating an animal with its own mother, right? Which is something that I guess animals do, right? Or we do with animals. So let's say you have the mishra, can you permit a pre meaning an offspring, im ha'im, with its mother, meaning the mother's let's say a horse, the father's a donkey, there's a child, right? Can that, assuming a male child, right? Can that male child be breeded with its mother if there's no father, then yeah, it's a horse, even though its father was a donkey. If there might be a father, then that would be prohibited because this animal is whatever we said before, offspring, and therefore mule or whatever, and therefore is potentially prohibited. So let's read that all inside. Mifshat pshitale. If it's obvious to Rabbi Yehuda that there's no father, then pre-im ha'im shari, then a child with its mother is never a problem. Ela amrit or amrit, I don't know what the L doesn't make sense. Amrit svukim esafkale, but if you say that he's unsure, then it would be a problem because pre-im ha'im would be usur just in case the father does count, in which case the child is 50% father, 50% mother, and its mother's 100% mother, right? So you can't be together. So let's try to prove this. So Tashma, we have a Braita which is going to hopefully open this up for us. What does the Braita say? Rabbi Yehuda says in this Braita, Kol hanoldim min hasus, any animal that comes from a horse, meaning its mother's a horse, afa pish avihen chamor, even though the father is a donkey, mutarim zebezeh. These animals, right? If you have a flock of these animals, they can all be breeded with each other. Doesn't matter that. Sorry?
I think they're herds.
Herds. Oh boy, all my animal terms wrong. They are herds of animals. So they can be mutar zebezeh. So that's what Rabbi Yehuda said. Now ask the Gemara, what's the mother and what's the father? If their mothers are horses, and the father of this animal is a chamor, and the father of this animal is a chamor, then of course it's the exact same thing. Why does Rabbi Yehuda have to come and say they can be breeded with each other? They're the identical status. They have the same mother, the same father. And whether you consider them to be mixed, you consider them to be one, it doesn't matter because you consider them to be the same thing. So clearly it can't be that case. Ella must be that they are mixed. Lav de avua de haisus, lavua de chamor. That one is a father that has a horse, one and a mother who's the opposite chamor. The other is the father's a horse and the mother's a chamor, right? And katani, we said, mutarim zebezeh. That they are, take it back. The both of them have mothers that are horses, right? One has a father that's also a horse, and one has a father that's a chamor. So Rabbi Yehuda says, mutarim zebezeh. What you see from here is that you don't worry about the father, because one has a chamor father, and if you had to worry, maybe that counts, then it would be partial chamor and usher to a horse. Alma, what you see from here is nifship shitale, that it's clear to Rabbi Yehuda that the father has no halachic implication. Says, well, you can't, it's not necessarily the case. Lo, You know what, Lolam, I would tell you that the fact is that the mothers are horses. The mother is a horse. And Avud hai chamar, vavud hai chamar. And each of the offspring had a father who was a chamar. So we said before that that would be obvious. What's Rabbi Yehuda telling us? I would have found this is a fascinating possibility that even though each animal is 50% chamar, 50% horse, and it's the same mother and father, not they don't have the same mother and father, but they have the same configuration. Okay, I like that. I was going to say same species, but mother and father. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can treat them as 50% and 50%, right? Very similar to we have this concept with the chatzi ev, chatzi bat chorin. Remember, if you recall, where you have a person who has two owners and one of them frees them, right? So the part that's a servant is still a servant. The part that's free becomes essentially a Jew. And we had this whole question, if you call them Kedushin, they can't marry anybody because they can't marry a free person. They can't marry a slave. And they can't also marry another person who's chatzi ev, chatzi bat chorin. Because we say by humans that the part of you that's free is sort of sleeping with the part of that person that's a slave. So you might have thought something similar would be true about animals, right? Ati tzad zus mishtamesh b'tzad chamar. That the 50% of it that's a horse is sleeping with the 50% of the other one that's a chamar, or etc. The tzad chamar mishtamesh b'tzad zus kamashma. That's a little bit too far to go with animals, right? You're 50% donkey, 50% horse. That's a species. But the point is that it is something that is notable that even though they're both 50% donkey, 50% horse, and it's the same parent, it's still permitted with each other. So you can't prove from here according to Rabbi Yehuda. So Tashma, let's try to prove it from the next Braita. Now, you're with us here? Okay, it's complicated. First word on the line, 20 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Now, Rabbi Yehuda is another Braita about Rabbi Yehuda. You have a pirda. And a pirda, how do we translate? Parrot is a donkey, we translate?
A female mule.
Thank you. A mule is the pirda. That's exactly. So you have a pirda. So parrot in Torah means a mule. Pirda is a female mule. And you have this pirda that's tav'ah, right? She is in heat, as they say. She needs to be mated with, or you're going to have a lot of trouble in your farm, right? So a mule in heat needs a partner. Says the Braita, Ein marbiyin aleh. You can't, mate with her. Lo sus, but lo chamor elamina. You can't bring a horse. You can't bring a donkey, which is what this mule came from. You have to bring its min, meaning another mule, to mate with it, because otherwise it's client, right? Now, it says the Gemara, but if Rabbi Yehuda is clear that the father doesn't matter, so who cares? Why do you have to say only another donkey, right? If it came, remember, a donkey comes from a horse and a mule comes from a horse and a donkey, right? So why don't you say that this mule can sleep with another animal that's the same as its mother, right? Lirva ala mina di'ima. Why, whatever its mother was, whether its mother was a horse or a donkey, the mule could have a partner that's the same thing.
Except mules are sterile.
Right, but I guess they still have go in heat. I don't know. Anyways, says the Gemara, well, the truth, it has to be a case where you don't know who its mother was, right? The mule doesn't tell you. You found the mule. You don't know whether its mother was the horse or its mother was the donkey. So says the Gemara, well, then why don't you say that? It said in the Braita, Ella Mina Katani, right? It said only its own thing, meaning only another mule. But the reality is it's not only another mule, it's another mule plus whatever its mother is. Hachikamer. It says, well, that's what it means in the Braita. Ein marbiyin aleh lo min sus lo min chamar. You can't have it mate with a horse or a donkey. Lefisha ein yodin bimina. Because you don't know what it is. You found this mule on the side of the road, whatever. You bought the mule at auction, and you just don't know. But you can mate it with another mule because it's the same thing. So it could be that Rabbi Yehuda agrees that the mother is the only thing that matters. You just don't know what mother this animal had. Ask the Gemara now a very, very fascinating question, which is that even if you don't know what the mother is, what about the fact that we have simanim? We have signs that tell you what its mother is. Meaning the rabbis had this understanding, which I am not equipped to say I have any experience with, that an animal that's I call it a mule, but what you'll remind me, hinny, are different. And what do we see different is that they will, whether the animal's mother is a horse or animal's mother is a donkey, they will have different features. What are those features? Livdok b'simanim. Damar Abaya, because Abaya said to us, or taught, that avi kalei, if the animal, this mule, right, which I'm going to call, which might be a hinny, is mule has a thick voice than bar chamra, then its mother must have been a chamor. Tzaniv Kale, if it has a thin voice, Rashi says, it's very funny, Rashi, because I don't know much about horses. Rashi says, like a clear voice, like horses cry out, which I guess is what he calls thin. Then Bar Susya, then you know it came from a horse. And Rav Papa said, I got another siman, Rav Ravan Udne, if it's got big ears and a small tail, V'zutra Ganufte, then of course everyone knows that's a donkey. They got big ears, Bar Chamra. Okay, perfect. Got it. Okay, you got pictures in this of big ears of the donkey, and that's a donkey, right? And if it's zutrin udne, if the ears are small and rabba gunufte, but the tail is long, then barsusia, and the mother is a horse, which I guess is all saying that the mother's genetics sort of give more influence. But whether, again, so why can't you just check this animal, this donkey, this mule, sorry, that you bought at the side of the road, and see if it's a mule that came from a horse or a mule that came from the mother was a horse or a donkey? Interesting. Well, obviously the case is where it had no ears or tail, right? Where it was elame, it was mute, so you couldn't hear its voice, and its ears were chopped off. So you found this motherless, mutilated mule, and it's in heat, and you've got to figure out what to do.
They really had too much time on their hands.
This is great. This is a classic Gemara case. Anyways, as the Gemara, once you get that picture out of your mind, my Havila.
Was it cut off before the knee,
exactly.
or above the knee?
Thankfully, you're not worrying about treifo this time. So my Havila. So what is the conclusion? Meaning, is Rabbi Yehuda clearly of the opinion that the father doesn't matter, or he wasn't sure? Maybe the father doesn't matter. Says Rav Huna bar Rav Shua. Rav Huna bar Rav Shua said, 4 lines to the bottom, if that's what we're up to. 5 lines, yeah. Amar Rav Huna bar Rav Yeshua hakol modim b'priya aim asur. You know, everybody agrees that a offspring with its mother would be asur. Shmamina, you see from here, sfuki misafkele shmamina. That the Chachamim would say it's asur because you choshin l'zera'av. So a child with its mother, you got to deal with the father if the father's a different species. But Rabbi Yehuda, why would it be asur if you're not choshin l'zera'av? It must be that when he says ein choshishim, it means he's not convinced that the zera'av. So like otovet beno, you wouldn't give makot, right? But he doesn't know for sure. He's safek, and therefore you are choshesh. Shmamina. Now, Amrle Reb Abba l'Shami. Reb Abba said to Shami something very interesting. Ki ma'ayon li kudnita. When you get me kudnita are mules, berispak for my wagon, then ayin lahanach dedamin lahadadi. I want you to get 2 mules that look the same, meaning violly, sorry, and then they'll pull me. Alma Kasavra, what you see from here is he holds ein chosheshin l'zera'av, that you don't really care about what the father is, meaning these are 2 mules, right? You have no idea if they come from a donkey or from a horse. In theory, if you worried about the father, it would be Kilayim. If one came from a horse, one came from a donkey. Said Rabbi Abba to Shammai, just check that the mother's the same. As long as you know the mother's the same, I don't care what the father is, and therefore he's ein chosheshin l'zera'av. But you also see from here, turn the page, that simanim doraita. That when we say these are simanim, that it comes from a donkey or a mule, that means the Torah really allows you to rely on these simanim. It's not like just derabanan, you can rely on it, to help you out. Because here he's clearly, it would be a problem if the mother was a horse and a donkey, irrespectively. And he's relying on the fact that the ears are long to prove that it's not. So you see that it's a problem, but you can rely on these simanim to solve the problem. Tanur Rabbanan. Says the Gemara, let us get a little bit deeper into this, the same question. Otovet beno, right? So our topic of our parak, you can't check the mother and its child, some say a father and its child, on the same day. Says the Braita, noheg b'klayim. This is true about an animal that comes from kilayim. So let's say you have an animal that's a mixture and it has a child. You can't check that child, even though it's somewhat different than its mother. And it also applies to a koi. I don't know if Steinsaltz uses the same kfi, does he say? He says koi. Okay. I never knew growing up. A koi. Now, a koi we're going to see, according to most people, we're going to have a different opinion tomorrow, is a mixture of a behema and a chaya. So unlike regular kilayim, which would be 2 behemot together, right? It's a wild animal and a domestic animal. It's
Here it says a goat and a deer.
Right. So a deer is a wild animal, is a chaya, and a goat is a behema. That's the important point about a koi in this iteration. Okay, and you have to worry about otov et bno, which we're going to see means ein choshen l'zerav. But we'll get there, right? And Rebbe Eliezer Omer, well, it depends. Kilayim haba min ha'ezu min Rachel. If you have kilayim that comes from a two behemot, an ez and a Rachel, I don't want to even translate because I never know what these things are.
A
But
Rachel is a ewe,
right,
and
so
is
a goat.
a goat.
Okay, thank you. I just always get them wrong. A goat and a ewe. That because they're both behemot, then otovat beno nohegbo. But a koi ain otovat beno nohegbo. A koi, right, does not have a question of otovat beno. And on Rav Chisda, so Rav Chisda, what are we talking about? Ezu koi shnechalkubo Rebbe Eliezer chachamim zaba min hatayash umin hatzviya. That's what comes from a goat and a deer, right, or a doe if there's a female deer, as they sing, right? So now says the Gemara. 1 second. Let's figure this out. Hechidami. What is the case of this koi, on which Rebbe Eliezer, says that there is no otovet beno, right? Says the Gemara. Hechidami. Ilema b'tayasha ba'al tzviya. Let's say you have a goat, right? That is with a doe, so a female deer. V'yolda, and they have an offspring, which I don't know if that's possible, but the Gemara says it's possible. Because shachat la ulivra, and now you're shechting the mother, who's the deer, and the fetus, right, and the child. Says the Gemara, but Amar of Chisda,
fetus or child?
Child, son, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
bra is
means child,
means born.
Right, correct. That's the case. Sorry,
Like bria.
Yolda. We already said Yolda. Because shachat la ulibra, you shecht it and its child on the same day. The Amar of Chisda, but Rav Chisda said akomodim behit tzviya benat tayash shepatur. Right? Rabbi Chisda already said that everybody agrees that if the mother, is a tzviya, right? So the mother is a
Deer.
thank you. And the child looks like a tayash because the father's a tayash, right? That you're patur. Why are you patur? Because se ubeno amar achvana. When the Torah says you take an animal and you shech it and its child, it says shar o seh, right? So meaning the mother has to be a seh. The mother can never be a deer, right? Velo tzvi ubeno. You never are chayv if the mother is a tzvi. Ella, the case must be where the father was a tzvi, haba'at tayasha, the mother was a goat, v'yoldan, they have an offspring, and then you're kashachat la ulebrei. And you shecht the mother, who's a goat, and the offspring, which is a mixture, a koi as we're calling it. And that's where the Tanakhama says there's otovet beno, and Rebbe Eliezer says there isn't. Says, but that can't be the case, because Amar of Chisda, hakol modim, everybody admits, bihi tayasha, when the mother is a tayash, ubenat tzvi, and the child comes from a tzvi, shechayav. That because Se'al Merachmana, ubeno kolto, it doesn't matter what the child is. Torah never talks about the species of the offspring, it only talks about the species of the mother. So that doesn't make any sense either. Who cares if it's mixed? The Olam says, Gemara, you're obviously the case has to be we're talking about a grandchild, right? Obviously. B'tayash haba'ad tzviya. Like the grandparents, we're going to call them here, are mixed, right? So there's a grandmother who's a deer. I don't know if grandmother's the right term here, but anyways, the top generation is a deer that goes with a goat. V'yolda bat, and they have a daughter. And this daughter is a koi, right? Because she comes from mixed behema and chaya. But she has half tayash, maybe, right? And then she has another child, bat yolda ben, which I think Rashi says doesn't have to be a ben, it could be a bat too. But anyways, the daughter has another offspring. So there's second generation and third generation. And you shech now the second generation and the third generation, right? Because shachat la, ulebrei. So now, that's the machloka about whether there's otovet beno. Because Rabbanan Savri, and I'm just trying to get all the names here, the Rabbanan are of the opinion, look, you have to be choshishin l'zera av, right? And therefore, this second generation, who came from a deer and a goat, because you worry about the father was a goat. So this second generation animal is a koi, but it's a partial set, right? And seva filu miktzat seh. When the Torah says the animal, the mother or the parent has to be a seh, it's even if it's partial 50% seh, meaning the mother was a deer. So the middle generation counts, and then the next one, of course, is the same as the mother, and it will be the same. But Rebbe Eliezer holds ein choshishin l'zera ha'av, and therefore, because the second animal was born from a goat and a deer, and you don't care about the deer because you don't care about the father, sorry, the opposite, a deer and a goat, right? And you only care about the mother who was a deer. So then it's not a seh, it's only a deer. And therefore it can't be chayiv and oto v'etbeno because the oto has to be a seh or a shor. The seh afilo mixat seh lo amrinon. He doesn't say seh afilo mixat seh because the reason you don't say seh afilo mixat seh is it's not even mixat seh because the father was irrelevant and the mother was a deer. So it's not even mixat seh. Says the Gemara, okay, well, if that's the machloket, why do you have to tell me this crazy case about a koi? Just tell me again the same machloket of Chananya and the Rabbanan of yesterday, right? So why don't you just say that machloket? Says the Gemara, we're exactly halfway down Ayin Tet Amud Bet in the middle. James just joined, so I'm trying to get you caught up here. But in the middle of a sugya of how much we worry when an animal is mixed breed about the not gender, the species of the father. If they had argued, if Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim had just argued, like in the same machloket of Chananya and the Rabbanan, about Oto ve'et beno from the father, Hava mina, that beha, in this case of a koi, afilu Rabbanan moda, desev afilu miktzatze lo aminan. That even the Rabbanan would admit that although they care about the father, the Torah very clearly limits Oto ve'et beno to be shar oseh. And if the animal is 50% seh, but 50% shot, 50% deer, maybe it's not a seh. And so maybe even the Chachamim would not have agreed that this is Oto ve'et beno, and therefore they had to argue about this case as well. And that's why they argued in this case. But the reality is the machloket Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim is the same machloket as Chananya and the Rabbanan is yesterday, of whether it's Chosheshin l'zera av or ain't Chosheshin l'zera av. Okay? Ask the Gemara, what about the following Mishnah? So this Mishnah in Masechet, somewhere obscure, Bikurim, okay, talks about whether you can shecht a koi on Yom Tov. So remember again, a koi is an animal that has one parent, at least according to the Gemara now, one parent that's a behema, one parent's a chaya, a goat and a deer is the case that the Gemara had, okay? And it could be either way. You could be a koi whether the father's a goat and the mother's a deer, or vice versa. There might be different halacha, but it's called a koi. Says the Mishnah in Bikurim, if you have a koi, ein shochtin oto b'yom tov. You shouldn't shechten on Yom Tov, right? Generally, you're allowed to shecht an animal on Yom Tov and eat it. The problem is that if you have a chaya, if you shecht a deer on Yom Tov, you have a mitzvah of kisoy adam. And you do kisoy adam on Yom Tov. We had discussed in Beitza whether you need to have the dirt from before Yom Tov, but you do kisoy adam on Yom Tov. But of course, if it's a behema, you don't do kisoy adam because you don't need to do kisoy adam. To one of the prakim we're going to have later is knowing only by a chaya, not by a behema. So you don't know if this animal needs kisoy adam or not. So you shouldn't shecht it on Yom Tov because you don't know. But if you do, im shachatu im nechasin tamo. If you do, don't cover the blood because you don't know if it needs it, and it's not dochash Yom Tov if it doesn't need it. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. Now ask the Gemara 1 second. What kind of koi is this? Is the father a deer, or is the mother a deer, or is the mother a donkey, a goat? If the father is a tayash, a goat, and the mother is a tzviya, so the mother of this animal is a deer, the yolda, and then it gives birth, why is there a question about kisoy adam? Bein the Rabbanan, who are chosheshim l'zera av, bein the Rebbe Eliezer, it has a mother, and the mother's a deer. So this animal needs to have kisoy adam. Right? Lishchot v'lichasei. You should shecht it and cover the blood. It's definitely a partial chaya. You need to cover it, right? Because it says tzvi. When you cover an animal, you have to cover it tzvi. Afilu mitzat tzvi. This is definitely partial tzvi. No one's going to say if the mother's a tzviya that there's no tzvi in this animal, right? Ella, it must be the opposite. The father was a tzvi. The father was a deer, and he was ba ala tayasha on a goat. And then there's a child, and this child is a koi, whose mother is a goat, the yolda. Says the Gemara, well, so what? Still, either Rabbanan who are choshin l'zera av, then the fact that the father's a deer means that this is a partial deer and it needs kisoy adam. So shecht it and lichsi and cover the blood. And either Rebbe Eliezer who says you don't worry about the father, so then it's a behema. So lishchot v'lo lichsi, right? There's no you shecht it on Yom Tov and don't cover the blood. What's the uncertainty, right? Says the Olam, the uncertainty is the following case. It's bitzvia ba'al tayasha. It is the second case. The father's a deer, the mother is a goat. The question is, so we said it's obvious. Either you care about the father and you cover it, or you don't care about the father and it's a behema, you don't have to cover it. But the answer here is Rabbanan svuke misafkelu. When the Rabbanan say chosheshim l'zera av, they don't mean we for sure give it the father's DNA. It means we might give it the father's DNA, right? And therefore, for regards to Otovet Bno, you can't shecht it because it might be part of the father might count. But for Yom Tif, we don't know if you need to do Kisoy Adam, right? They were uncertain. And so they were unsure, and therefore they said it's better not to shecht it because we don't know for sure if you should cover the blood. But if you do shecht it, don't cover it just in case.
Right,
Okay,
because it's not a sveka.
it's not a svek, it's one suffix.
Yeah.
Correct.
So I'm
So
just trying to.
yeah, it's confusing. Says where okay, so that is the answer. So umidil rabbanan misafkalahu. So if the rabbanan are unsure, meaning when the rabbanan said the words choshishim l'zera'av, you worry about the father's DNA. They meant you might have to worry about the father's DNA. But Rebbe Eliezer, who argued, must hold the father's nothing, right? You don't worry about the father at all. Rebbe Eliezer pshitale that you don't worry about the father. So no DNA. I mean, it does have DNA, but no halachic DNA from the father. Says more, but that doesn't make sense with the next brayta. But Tanya, the following brayta, we're at the fifth to last narrow line in the Vilna Shas, has zeroa v'halachayim v'akeba. Right? Again, this is another parak we're going to have later. You give matnot kuna, right? When you shecht an animal, you give the zroa, which means some part.
The leg.
Thank you. The thigh, right? And the chayim, which is the side of the lechi, sorry, is the cheek, thank you. And the keva, which is one of the stomachs we talked about, to a kohen. Now, the halacha is that you only do zerah, chayim, and keva on a behema, because the pasuk says sharoset. So if you shecht a deer, you don't have to give that to the kohen. Okay? So now you shechted you have zerah, chayim, and keva. Says the Braita, nohagim b'koi ubiklayim. If you shecht an animal that's a mixture, let's say behema, well, that's easy, right? A seh and a whatever we had before, donkey and a goat, not a sheep and a goat. Or you shecht a koi, which again is a mixture of a deer and a goat. You have to give matnot kuna to the kohen. That's a Tanakama, which makes it sound, of course, like you have to worry about the father, right? If the father was a goat, right? Rebbe Eliezer says, no, it depends. Kalayim, if you have a mixture, which means habam min ha'ezu min harachel, it comes from a goat and a ewe, then, because they're both behemot, chayv and matanot. But if it comes from a koi, because one parent, let's say, is a chaya, patur min ha'matanot. Okay, that's the Braita. So you can see why it's related. Now, it says where again, you have to always differentiate. When you say it's a mixture, what is the mixture? Is it the female or the male that was the chaya or the behema in this case? B'maya skina, right? What is the genealogy of this animal? Ilema b'taya shabalat tzviya. If we're talking about where the mother was a deer and the father was a goat, v'yolda, and there's a baby, right? So this child now is a koi, but it's a koi whose mother was a deer. So then I understand. I said it wrong? Yeah, no, right. Tayash about
Sorry,
yeah. So then Bishma, the Rebbe Eliezer, the Patar, I get the Rebbe Eliezer says you don't have to give Matno Kuna because it's not a behema, right? Because he holds that Seva Filo Mixat Seh, it could easily be partially a Seh, but since you're not Choshishim Lazera Av Lo Amrinan, right? This is not a partial Seh. The father was a Seh, we don't care about the father. The mother was a Tzviya, and so the animal is a Chaya, and therefore you don't give anything to the Kohen. El Rabbanan, who says you do give it to the Kohen, I don't understand why. Right? The fact, I understand that even if it's a partial behema, a partial say you'd have to give it to the Kohen. But I understand that the father is a behema, but the mother is a deer. The mother's a chaya. So this animal is at least 50% wild animal. So Bishlama, Palga, Lo Yavle, I understand that half you don't have to give because half of it clearly comes from the mother. But the other 50% you should have to give. Irich paga lemalei. I'm sorry, you should have to give, but the Kohen would have to prove. Remember, we just said according to the Chachamim, it's svuke misafkele, right? It may be that the father counts, and maybe the father doesn't count. So if the father does count, then the father was a goat, and so this animal is 50% goat, and you have to give 50% to the Kohen. But if the father doesn't count, then the animal is 0% goat, and you have to give 0% to the Kohen. So how could you say you have to give matanot to the Kohen? Let the Kohen come and prove that it's really a goat, which you can't because it's a suffix. So let me read that inside, the second wide line. Idich paga lemale, why don't the owner of the animal say to the Kohen, you prove that that's the case, and then you could take your half. But since you can't prove it, because we said the Chachamim were unsure, then sure, for Otovet B'no, you have to be machmir. But a Kohen can't force you to pay him. Ella must be the case is the opposite. Tzvi haba ala tayasha. So again, now the opposite. The father was a deer. The mother is a goat. And then there's a child, which we're going to call a koi, okay, a mixed behima chaya. And Yolda. So Bishul the Rabbanan, I get first. So now, again, this animal, the mother is a goat. So for sure, it's 50% goat. And so the Kohen, when we say the Chachamim say you have to give Matanot Kuna, you don't have to give 100%, because if you were Choshim L'Zera Av, then it would be 50% Behema, 50% Chaya. If you're Ein Choshim L'Zera Av, it's 100% Behema. So I understand when the Chachamim say you have to give Matanot, they mean you have to give half the Matanot, right? And the Kohen would have to prove the other, which they can't. So Bishlam al Rabbanan Mechayav B'chatzi Matanot. El Rebbe Eliezer, what does Rebbe Eliezer say? You're putter. You should actually have to pay, or right? He says you're putter. You have to pay everything. The Chayav B'kulu Matanot, right? Because if Rebbe Eliezer says you don't worry about the father was a deer, so you don't care. The mother was a goat. You should have to pay 100%. So how can it make sense that you don't? Lo'olam, the case must be the opposite. Tzvi Abal Tayasha. And sorry, this case. It's actually, we're talking about a case where the mother was a goat. And so we said, if the mother's a goat, why, according to Rebbe Eliezer, don't you have to pay 100% matanot kuna? The Yolda. Rebbe Eliezer nami misfuki misafkile. Rebbe Eliezer also is unsure. Rebbe Eliezer also says, well, maybe you don't worry about the father, in which case it's 100% goat, but maybe you do. And if you do worry about the father, then it's 50% goat and 50% chaya, and then you don't have to pay. Now, of course, you're going to ask, why don't you at least pay 50%? But before you ask that question, we're going to ask a basic question, which is, you said the Chachamim were unsure, you said Rebbe Eliezer's unsure, so where do they argue, right? Kibon de Rabbanan misafkele, or Rebbe Eliezer misafkele, but my pligi. What is the difference in the Rabbanan and Rebbe Eliezer if neither one of them has any understanding, right? They both say, we don't know if the father counts. Answers the Gemara, they both really feel that way. So unlike Hananya and the Rabbanan, where it was very clear, Hananya said Choshim Zera Av, Rebbe Eliezer is saying, I think maybe, and the Chachamim are saying, we think maybe. So what's the difference? The difference is, again, the mother of this animal is a goat, right? The father is a deer. So the animal is either 50% goat, 50% deer, or 100% goat and 0% deer, right? If you're Choshim Zerav or not. The machloket between Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim is on the assumption that it's 50% goat. Is that enough to mechayev matznot kuna, right? Because I've been making the assumption the whole daf today that if it's 50% goat, you pay 50% of the matanot. But maybe it's not the case. Maybe 100% goat means you pay, 50% goat means you don't pay anything. And that's the machloket Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim. So I'm going to read that on top. They're arguing about whether when the Torah says it has to be a seh, it means if it's a partial seh, you pay partial. Rabbanan savri seh afilu mitzat seh. Rabbanan say yes, that as long as it's a partial seh, and in this case, because the mother's a goat, it's for sure at least 50% seh, you have to give matznot kuna. And Rebbe Eliezer savar seh v'lo mitzat seh. Rebbe Eliezer says no, if it's not 100% goat, you pay nothing. And since it may not be 100% goat because suki misafkale, you don't have to pay matznot kuna. And so we're going to stop there at the third line. We're in the middle. We're not going to pick this up tomorrow morning.
Would this mean we would change the view of what he said about Kisui Adam?
So don't forget anything. So sorry, say that again.
Would we change his position about Kisui Hadam now that he has a doubt whether it's for him or
not? We will discuss that tomorrow. How about that? James, the next words are Amar Papa Hilkach le'inyin Kisui Adam. So the Gemara is going to go through it, but you got to come tomorrow morning at 7:45, unfortunately. So, wait, Miriam, James, can I ask you guys a quick question while I have you?
Yeah.
You just did.
Next Sunday. So tomorrow we're learning 7:45, but next Sunday.
26th.
I'm sorry.
The 26th.
The 26th. I'm not able to do the morning because I have a flight early in the morning.
Okay.
So I can either record it or we can learn later in the day if that's possible for anyone.
I can learn later in the day.
So I'll put it on the WhatsApp. I'm gonna try because I have an 8 a.m. flight, so I obviously can't do 7:45, but I land at some point.
Where you go?
Going to Vail, Colorado, to Denver, and then Vail. But like by the evening, if that's okay, or sometime in the afternoon. Okay, so that's next Sunday. Okay, perfect. I hope to see you tomorrow morning.
You could bring us back a deer.
I don't know if it mated with a donkey or a goat or
You're a doctor, figure it out.
Mixtures of goats and deers can't actually exist.
Okay, well,
But there are three kinds of animals that look like they could be. There's a Japanese animal, a chamois, which is European, and a dik-dik, which I think is
what they're talking about?
what they're talking
Yeah.
about. Tiny,
One lives in the mountains in France, in the Alps.
short, simple
Oh,
stuff.
yeah. Okay, we're gonna have it tomorrow. We're actually gonna, there's an opinion that says something more tomorrow. It's one of 4 opinions that says that there is, in fact, there's no such thing as this mixture, and it's a donkey that looks like a mixture because it's some animal from the hills or something. So
All right.
okay, Shavua Tov.
From the Alps.
Shabbat tov.
From the
Thank
Alps.
you.
Shabbat tov.